This man used to be an Al-Qaeda commander in Iraq when it was killing U.S. troops there. Yet here he is shaking hands with President Donald Trump on May 14th, 2025.
How is that possible? Welcome to Buried Origins. Today I'll explain this crazy story about how a former Al-Qaeda commander went on to shake hands with the president of a country that once had a $10 million bounty on him. So let's get into it. Okay, so Shara'a is Syrian and spent most of his early years in the capital Damascus, living a pretty normal and reserved life. But when he was 18, in the year 2000, the Second Palestinian Intifada broke out, which was a mass rebellion against Israel that was very popular across the Arab world. And he stated himself that it was this event that radicalized him. Over his life, Shara'a has been somewhat of a chameleon, changing his appearance and motivations drastically. And this transition from a quiet kid to a religious and political activist was his first change. But while Syria, under the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, was no place for political activism, Ahmed al-Sharaa got his opportunity to fight for a cause that he believed in when 3 years later the US invaded Syria's neighbor Iraq, and Shara'a, like many in the region, answered the call to go fight the invading power, and so Shara'a jumped on a bus and headed to Iraq. There he quickly joined Al-Qaeda, which before the invasion had almost no presence in Iraq at all, despite what the Bush administration had told the American people. They had lied just like they did with the weapons of mass destruction. But the US invasion drove thousands to pick up arms against the invading power and join groups like Al-Qaeda, and Shara'a quickly proved himself, rising up the ranks with incredible speed, with some reports even claiming that he became second in command of all of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But in 2006, Shara'a was caught by US forces while planting explosives, and he was imprisoned for 5 years. He was released in 2011, the same year that the Syrian Civil War began, and he was sent by the global head of Al-Qaeda to go establish a branch in his old home country, which he did in 2012. Shara'a led his group of Al-Qaeda for years, fighting against both the government and other rebel groups, and killing a lot of innocent people in the process. But in 2016, Shara'a shocked the world by cutting off all ties with Al-Qaeda and renaming his group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and rebranding it as a strictly Syrian group. Now, the answer as to why he did this depends on who you ask, but we can discuss at least the two leading theories. The first one is that Shara'a was clashing with some other Al-Qaeda leaders at the time, and so this was merely an attempt to separate himself from Al-Qaeda and consolidate power over the group that he had spent years building. Another theory is that it was actually a PR move. The history behind this is that in the early years, the Syrian revolution was distinctly secular, but as the years went on, the rebellion became dominated by hardcore groups like ISIS and Shara'a's branch of Al-Qaeda, which were often pursuing a global struggle with objectives beyond Syria. This made it really difficult for foreign governments to support the revolution, which many had been doing in the early years. So the thought process goes that Shara'a saw the greater picture and realized that his group stood a better chance if it separated itself from the Islamist groups that were seeking global upheaval. So his renamed group, HTS, declared that it had no objectives beyond Syria, and even started fighting the remnants of Al-Qaeda that didn't join him and ISIS. As the years went on, the war turned in favor of the Syrian government, and eventually the only rebel groups still fighting it were Kurds in the northeast and Shara'a's group, HTS, which hid itself away in a small northwestern province called Idlib and invited Turkey to establish military bases there to prevent a Syrian attack, as the Syrian government would not dare start a war with its much more powerful neighbor. And so by 2020, the Syrian Civil War seemed to come to an end, with Syria divided between the government, HTS, and the Kurds, with all heavy fighting stopping in a stalemate. HTS was kind of just doing their thing in Idlib, and was mostly forgotten about as people stopped following the war. They weren't seen as a serious threat to the Syrian government because they were restricted to such a small province that was so far away from the Syrian capital. In these years, HTS started to change its appearance drastically, and stopped calling for attacks on the West. Shara'a gave an interview to PBS in 2021 in which he wore a suit and emphasized his group meant no harm to the governments in Europe and the US. It was yet another dramatic shift in appearance for Shara'a, and was likely driven by pragmatic needs to distance himself from his roots in Al-Qaeda, although again, it depends on who you ask. But regardless, Syria was seen as a frozen conflict and was mostly forgotten about, until November 27th, 2024. When HTS began a surprise offensive against the Syrian government which shocked the entire world. The Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad had resisted years of armed rebellion by tens of thousands of fighters trying to overthrow it, armed and supported by an array of foreign governments. But it stood its ground. Barely at times, but it did. And when it regained most of the territory in Syria, the rebellion was seen as failed. No one expected anything to change. So the world was dumbfounded when HTS tore across Syria, sending government forces that had suppressed a rebellion for over a decade running for the hills in just days. Within 2 weeks, HTS and a few other rebel groups had taken complete control of the capital Damascus, and the rule of the Assad family, which had been in power for 53 years, came to a sudden and unexpected end. Shara'a declared himself president and immediately adopted a very moderate tone, declaring a new Syria for all Syrians, regardless of their religion or ethnic group. Quite a change for a man whose soldiers had conducted ethnic purges 10 years prior. Because of his problematic background, the world was very cautious towards Shara'a at first. But to the surprise of many, his actions actually matched his words. He didn't install a hardcore Islamist government like he had fought for years to do, and he declared that his government was solely focused on Syria, with no hostility towards the US or Israel. And so it seemed like he genuinely wanted to play the role of a serious world leader and reintegrate Syria into the world order. His main objectives, right off the bat, have been internal security and restoring the Syrian government's non-existent revenue and restarting its devastated economy. Now, on internal security, he's been pretty successful, given that the country easily could have entered another phase of full-scale war. And so far there have been pockets of heavy fighting, but it's been short-lived. But for the economy, Shara'a faced a major hurdle, which were the sanctions that the US placed on the Syrian government, and more importantly, the sanctions that the US placed on anyone who dealt with the Syrian government, which effectively prevented any investment in Syrian reconstruction. So Shara'a needed to curry favor with the Trump administration, and thankfully for him, there was a strong US ally in the region that wanted to see a new Syria prosper, Saudi Arabia. The de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, saw that a prosperous and stable Syria under a man like Shara'a was better than risking more war. So when Trump was visiting the kingdom in May, Mohammed bin Salman arranged a meeting between Shara'a and Trump and pushed Trump to remove sanctions. Trump agreed to both things, and surprisingly to many of his hardcore supporters, allowed himself to be seen on camera shaking hands with a former Al-Qaeda commander. Trump was even enthusiastic about removing sanctions, saying,
"But now it's their time to shine. It's their time to shine. We're taking them all off." And so I say, good luck, Syria. Show us something very special like they've done, frankly, in Saudi Arabia.
So that's the fascinating story about how a normal Syrian teenager went on to become a senior Al-Qaeda commander and eventually a world leader who shook hands with Donald Trump, president of a country that once had a $10 million bounty on his head. Well, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please share and subscribe. See ya.